Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. In this video, we'd like to get a clear understanding of the following terms: white ramus, gray ramus, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, and finally, splanchnic nerve. Let's get to work. So we've been talking about the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system, which consists of chains of two neurons. The first neuron resides within the central nervous system in the lateral horn of the spinal cord between T1 and L2, which explains why the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes called the thoracolumbar system. The preganglionic axon synapses onto the postganglionic cell body within one of the sympathetic ganglia, which means that the postganglionic cell body is always located within one of the sympathetic ganglia. And this makes sense because if you looked up the definition of ganglia in a textbook, what you would find is that a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies which is located outside of the central nervous system. So a ganglion is a group of cell bodies, of neurons, that's located outside of the central nervous system, and that's always true, of course, in the sympathetic nervous system as well. We also know that within the sympathetic nervous system, there are two different types of ganglion where synapses occur between the pre- and post-ganglionic cells. The first set is called the sympathetic chain ganglia, which is also known as the paravertebral ganglia because they lie alongside, or para, to the vertebral column. The second group of sympathetic ganglia are called the prevertebral ganglia, or the pre-aortic ganglia, because they lie directly in front of the vertebral column in the midline. In order to understand exactly what is a white ramus and what is a gray ramus, we're going to focus on the 3D trajectory of sympathetics that follow this first pathway. In other words, they come out of the spinal cord, they synapse in a sympathetic chain ganglion, in other words, a paravertebral ganglion, and after synapsing in the sympathetic chain ganglion, send their axons out towards their target tissues. Towards the end of this video, we're going to look at the second type of sympathetic, which emerges from the spinal cord and completely ignores the sympathetic chain ganglia. Instead, these nerves are bound for prevertebral ganglia, and so we use slightly different terminology to describe that second group of sympathetic nerves. So we're going to follow the course of sympathetic nerves that emerge from the spinal cord, synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglia, and then send out their axons towards target tissues. Let's start with the location of the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetic nerve. In order to do that, of course, we're looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord somewhere between T1 and L2, the only spinal levels which contain cell bodies of preganglionic sympathetic neurons. So in red here, I'm putting in some cell bodies of preganglionic or presynaptic sympathetic neurons. In green, in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, I'm putting in some cell bodies of lower motor neurons, which will go out and directly synapse onto skeletal muscle fibers. And in blue, inside of the dorsal root ganglion, I'm putting in some cell bodies of primary sensory neurons, which send their axons both towards the central nervous system as well as out towards the periphery. This structure here, which is emerging from the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, is the dorsal root, and this structure here, which is emerging from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, is of course the ventral or anterior root. The lower motor neurons are sending their axons out into the periphery through the ventral root until the ventral root merges with the dorsal root, and I've drawn that here in black. And after the two roots, the dorsal and ventral roots, merge, this structure here is now called the spinal nerve. So what's contained within the spinal nerve? Axons of lower motor neurons moving outwards, ultimately destined for synapses at the neuromuscular junction, as well as the axons of sensory neurons, which are located in the dorsal root ganglion, which are carrying sensory information from the periphery back towards the central nervous system. Now, this red circle that I've drawn here is meant to be one of the sympathetic chain ganglia. And since it's a ganglion, it has to be a collection of postganglionic cell bodies, which I'm drawing in here in red. So these preganglionic sympathetics need to somehow make their way to the ganglion where they can synapse, and then the postganglionic axon can make its way towards the target tissue. So what ends up happening is the axons of preganglionic sympathetics join with the axons of the lower motor neurons by leaving the spinal cord in the ventral root, follow along with the ventral root until they join the spinal nerve. But they're not just going to continue along with the spinal nerve. They're going to branch off of the spinal nerve and head for a synapse in the sympathetic chain ganglion. Now, one other thing to note about this axon here of the preganglionic sympathetic, this axon here, which comes straight out of the central nervous system, okay, this axon is myelinated. And so when you look at myelinated axons in histological sections, myelinated axons, just like this axon, in other words, the axon of the preganglionic sympathetic neuron, they tend to appear white. I think of myelin as a sort of fatty covering around the axon, and in a traditional histological section, a myelinated nerve will appear white. So why is this important? Well, it's important because what this axon is going to do is it's going to branch off of the spinal nerve, and it's going to enter the sympathetic chain ganglion. And of course, it's going to synapse there onto this blue cell body of the postganglionic sympathetic neuron. So there's several terms we could use to describe this preganglionic axon, which is branching off of the spinal nerve and which is also myelinated. It's myelinated so it would appear white on a histological section, and it's a branch off of the spinal nerve, which explains why we call it a white ramus. White because it's myelinated, and ramus because ramus means literally a branch. So in blue, I'm coloring over exactly the piece of this preganglionic sympathetic axon that we would refer to as a white ramus. So what is a white ramus? It's that final piece of the preganglionic sympathetic axon that branches away from the spinal nerve and enters into the sympathetic chain ganglion. I'm going to switch colors to green for clarity now, but what's going to happen is after synapsing onto the postganglionic cell body within the sympathetic chain ganglion, the postsynaptic neuron is going to send its axon back towards the spinal nerve. But remember, the axon of the postganglionic neuron, okay, in other words, this axon in green here is unmyelinated, and when you look at unmyelinated nerves on a histological section, they appear gray. So it's not surprising that This piece of the postganglionic sympathetic axon, which I've highlighted again in red now, is called the gray ramus. Ramus because it's a branch now going back from the sympathetic chain ganglion to the spinal nerve, and gray because this axon is unmyelinated. So the white ramus is an off-ramp from the spinal nerve to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and the gray ramus is an on-ramp for the postganglionic axon from the sympathetic chain ganglion back onto the spinal nerve. So now we go back into 2 dimensions and we see that this here is, let's say, a sympathetic chain ganglion. This little piece of the axon of the preganglionic sympathetic neuron that enters into the sympathetic chain ganglion, that's the white ramus. Okay? White ramus says, welcome, okay, to the sympathetic chain ganglion. Now, the sympathetic chain ganglion contains the synapse between the pre- and postganglionic, and now the axon of the postganglionic neuron is interested in getting back onto the spinal nerve. So it's going to send a branch or ramus back onto the spinal nerve, but its axon is unmyelinated, so we call this little segment of the postganglionic axon a gray ramus, and the gray ramus, of course, says goodbye to the sympathetic chain ganglion. So hopefully that's an easy way to remember that the white ramus is the off-ramp from the spinal nerve to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and the gray ramus is the on-ramp back from the sympathetic chain ganglion back onto the spinal nerve. This video is running a little bit long, so why don't we leave the definition of dorsal ramus and ventral ramus and splanchnic nerve for the next video.